On October 8, 1943, over the German city of Bremen, a 26-year-old man named Hans Philipp bailed out of a burning Focke-Wulf 190. He was the second highest scoring fighter pilot in the German Air Force. 207 confirmed kills, trained since he was 19.
Decorated by the Reich, promoted by Goering, buried in the newspapers within a week. His parachute opened, then it didn't. The airplane that killed him was one his own squadron had 6 months earlier, called a flying barrel, too heavy, too slow, a joke. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt.
In the 31 days of that October, one American fighter group destroyed 39 German aircraft and lost only one of their own. The Luftwaffe called what the Americans were doing the American tactic. They had no counter for it. This is the story of how the ugliest fighter of the Second World War became the deadliest.
And of the mother in Meissen who would visit her only son's grave for 30 more years. April 15, 1943, 25,000 feet above the coast of occupied Belgium. The air at that altitude is thin enough to kill a man in 90 seconds if his oxygen line fails. It is also cold, 50 degrees below zero.
Inside the cockpits of a small formation of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, American pilots breathe through rubber masks and squint through frost-rimmed canopies at a sky they have crossed only once before. They are looking for a fight they do not know how to win. The formation belongs to the 4th Fighter Group.
Most of these men learned to fly in Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. They loved that airplane, small, light, responsive to a fingertip on the stick. They hated what they were flying now. The Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons empty. A Spitfire weighed less than 3.
Climbing into a P-47 after a Spitfire felt like trading a rapier for a sledgehammer. And no one had convinced these pilots that the sledgehammer belonged in the sky at all. Leading the flight was Major Don Blakesley, 25 years old, former Eagle Squadron. A man who had killed Germans over the English Channel in an aircraft he trusted. He was flying the sledgehammer today because he had orders to fly it. Somewhere below him, veteran pilots of Jagdschwader 26 were climbing to meet him. Between them and Blakesley lay a distance of 90 seconds and 2 entirely different theories of war. The Germans knew the Americans were coming.
They had watched the P-47 program from a distance for 18 months. Intelligence reports described the aircraft as absurd. A single-engine fighter weighing as much as a light bomber, an engine the size of a wine barrel, a cockpit large enough for a man to stand inside. German pilots who studied the specifications did not laugh. They shrugged.
Whatever the Americans were building, it was not built for the kind of combat that had defined European skies since 1939. Combat over Europe had one shape. You turned, you climbed, you turned again. The pilot who could bring his guns to bear 1 second faster killed the pilot who could not.
Every fighter design in the Luftwaffe reflected this truth. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was small and quick. The Focke-Wulf 190 was small and quick and vicious. Both aircraft had been sharpened for 4 years against Poles and French and British pilots. And thousands of dead men in 3 countries had certified the correctness of the design.
Blakesley saw them first, a cluster of dots rising from the direction of Ostend. He called them out over the radio. His voice was flat. The dots resolved into Focke-Wulf 190s, climbing hard, still below him, still unaware of the American formation. Blakesley pushed his stick forward.
His Thunderbolt tilted its enormous nose toward the earth and began to accelerate. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes. Blakesley got a Focke-Wulf in his sights, held the trigger, watched pieces of the German fighter tumble away, and pulled up. He had scored the first P-47 kill in history.
Behind him, the rest of the American formation dissolved into confusion. Radios failed. Aircraft got separated. 2 Thunderbolts developed engine trouble at high altitude and began to descend, streaming smoke. Another was hit by German fire and did not come home. The Americans landed at Debden that afternoon and counted the cost. 1 kill.
1 aircraft lost to combat. 2 lost to mechanical failure. Blakesley climbed out of his cockpit, stared at the airplane he had just used to kill a man, and said the sentence that would define the P-47 for the next 6 months. It ought to dive. It sure can't climb. The line traveled fast.
Within a week, every American fighter pilot in England had heard it. Within a month, it had reached crew rooms in Germany, translated and passed around and repeated with quiet satisfaction. The famous Blakesley, hero of the Eagle Squadron,
had confirmed what German pilots already suspected. The Thunderbolt was a mistake.
To understand why the Thunderbolt existed at all, you have to understand a man named Alexander Kartveli. He was 47 years old in the spring of 1943. He had been born in Tbilisi, in the Caucasus Mountains, in a country that no longer existed.
He had studied engineering in Paris and moved to New York in the 1920s with a suitcase and no English. By 1940, he was the chief designer at Republic Aviation on Long Island. He wore a suit to the drafting table. He worked in silence, and he did not believe that lightness was the answer.
Kartveli looked at the war in Europe and saw something other engineers missed. Aerial combat was climbing. Faster engines meant higher altitudes. Higher altitudes meant thinner air. Thinner air meant that everything a fighter did, turning, climbing, diving, happened at speeds no one had planned for.
The Spitfire was a masterpiece for the war it was designed to fight. It was not built for the war Kartveli saw coming. So he built something else. A fuselage wrapped around the largest air-cooled radial engine available in the United States. A turbo supercharger tucked into the tail to keep that engine breathing at 30,000 feet.
Wings thick enough to house 850 caliber machine guns. Structural steel where other designers used aluminum. The finished aircraft weighed 7 tons empty and could carry another 2 tons of fuel and ammunition. Republic delivered the first P-47Bs in 1942. The pilots who received them were not grateful.
In New York and Connecticut, the 56th Fighter Group broke airplanes and killed pilots learning to fly the machine. Some of the accidents were mysterious. A Thunderbolt would dive from 30,000 feet during a training run and never pull out. Investigators found wreckage strewn across a mile of American farmland.
They did not yet understand that the P-47's dive was so fast. Its propeller tips approached the speed of sound and shattered under the stress. The commanding officer of the 56th was a 28-year-old former combat observer named Hubert Zemke. He had watched the Battle of Britain from an RFAF airfield.
He had instructed Soviet pilots in the P-40. He was the son of German immigrants from Missoula, Montana, and he spoke enough German to read Luftwaffe technical manuals. Zemke did not like the P-47 either. He wrote later that the airplane accelerated poorly, climbed poorly, and disappointed him at every stage of his introduction to it.
His group arrived in England in January 1943. Their aircraft arrived 2 weeks later. They flew their first combat mission on April 13. 2 days after that, Blakesley's flight met the Focke-Wulfs over Belgium, and the reputation of the Thunderbolt was set in cement. But there was a problem with the reputation.
It was based on a single afternoon of combat and a single line spoken by a tired man climbing out of a cockpit. And it did not account for the war that was actually coming, because the war that was actually coming would not be decided by turning fights over the English Channel. It would be decided over Germany.
At altitudes that no Spitfire could reach, on missions that no Spitfire could fly, against a Luftwaffe that would soon be forced to defend the industrial cities of the Reich, against 1,000 bomber raids in daylight, and would have to send its best pilots up through freezing air to intercept formations of B-17s stretched across 50 miles of sky.
The Americans had a theory about how those raids would work. The theory had a name. It was called self-defending bombardment, and it said that if you flew enough B-17s in tight enough formation, with enough machine guns bristling from enough turrets, no fighter in Europe could stop you. The theory was wrong.
By the summer of 1943, it was already killing Americans in numbers the public back home would not learn about for another year. Bomber crews took off from East Anglia at dawn and did not come back. 20 aircraft lost on a single mission. 60. The B-17s could not defend themselves.
The Spitfires that escorted them could barely reach the Dutch coast. The P-38 Lightnings that were supposed to solve the range problem were being pulled to North Africa.
And the Thunderbolts, the mocked Thunderbolts, the 7-ton disappointment that could not climb, were the only fighters in the theater with the endurance to escort a bomber more than 100 miles into German airspace.
On June 26, 1943, over Forges-les-Eaux in occupied France, this contradiction produced a story that no one on either side knew how to interpret. A 23-year-old lieutenant named Robert Johnson was flying one of his early combat missions when Focke-Wulfs of Jagdgeschwader 26 caught his flight from above. Johnson had ignored a call to brake.
A cannon shell exploded behind his cockpit, his canopy jammed, his hydraulic system failed, his instrument panel filled with smoke. He tried to bail out. The canopy would not open. He tried to fly. The aircraft still answered the control.
Bleeding from his face, half blind, sitting inside a Thunderbolt that was streaming smoke from every seam, Johnson turned west and began flying toward England. A Focke-Wulf found him over the French coast. The German pilot moved into position behind Johnson and fired.
20mm cannon shells and machine gun rounds struck the P-47 across the fuselage and wings. Johnson counted the impacts by feel. When the German ran out of ammunition, according to Johnson's later account, he pulled alongside the American aircraft, close enough to see the pilot's face. He stared for a long moment. Then he saluted.
Then he flew away. Whether the salute happened exactly as Johnson remembered it, no German pilot ever came forward to confirm. But the airplane spoke for itself. Johnson landed at an airfield in southern England with more than 200 bullet and cannon holes in his Thunderbolt. Mechanics counted them. They photographed the airplane.
They shook their heads at what they saw. Johnson himself walked away with cuts on his face and a story he would tell for the rest of his life. The story reached Zemke that evening. Zemke understood immediately what it meant. The Thunderbolt had absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Spitfire 10 times over. The airframe was not a flaw.
It was information. It was telling him something about the aircraft he had been ordered to fly. He did not yet know what to do with the information. Neither did the German pilot who had flown away over the channel. Neither did the Luftwaffe intelligence officers who would eventually receive his after-action report.
Neither did anyone in the 8th Air Force headquarters who read Johnson's debrief and filed it and moved on to the next casualty list. The data existed. Nobody read it as doctrine. Summer passed. B-17 losses mounted. The Thunderbolt kept flying escort missions that ended over and over with the same pattern.
American fighters engaged German fighters. American fighters tried to turn with German fighters. American fighters died. In the crew rooms at Halesworth, 29-year-old Hubert Zemke sat with maps and after-action reports and began to work through a problem that no one had asked him to solve. He was not a natural pilot.
He was a natural mathematician. He had watched enough combat in enough aircraft to understand that fighter design was not a matter of taste, it was a matter of physics. And the physics of the P-47 said something very specific, if you were willing to listen. The aircraft could not turn. Fine. Then stop turning. The aircraft could not climb. Fine.
Then start above the enemy. The aircraft could dive faster than anything in Europe. Then use the dive. Zemke did not yet have a doctrine. He had the beginnings of one. And he had a group of pilots who were still in the summer of 1943 being killed by Focke-Wulfs and taught by their own commanders to fight in ways the Thunderbolt could not sustain.
He also had, whether he knew it or not, less than 4 months before the mathematics of the P-47 would collide with the mathematics of the Luftwaffe in a single month over northern Germany. And on the German side of that collision, a 26-year-old officer named Hans Philipp already commanded Jagdgeschwader 1.
He had 203 confirmed victories. He was the second highest scoring fighter pilot in the German Air Force. He had 6 months to live. October 1, 1943. A ceremony at the headquarters of Jagdgeschwader 1 in northern Germany.
26-year-old Hans Philipp stood at attention, while a superior officer pinned the insignia of Oberstleutnant to his collar, Lieutenant Colonel. The rank came with a war that had begun to eat its own veterans.
Philipp was the only child of a single mother from Meissen, a porcelain town in Saxony that had produced fine china for 200 years. His mother Alma had raised him alone on very little money. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1936 because it offered a future no other institution. In Germany offered a boy of his background.
He was, by that autumn, the second man in the Luftwaffe to pass 200 victories. Most of his kills had come on the Eastern Front, over frozen rivers and burning villages, against Soviet pilots who were still learning to fly the airplanes their government could give them. Now his war had changed.
He commanded fighters against the 8th Air Force. His enemies were no longer boys in obsolete yaks. They were factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh, flying machines their country had built by the tens of thousands. Protected by fighters he did not yet know how to kill.
3 days after his promotion on October 4th, an order came down from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The order was later summarized by German fighter historians who had seen the original text. It said that no weather condition would excuse a pilot from taking off against American bombers.
It said that any pilot who returned to base without a confirmed victory or clear evidence of combat would face a court-martial. It said that if a pilot exhausted his ammunition, he was to ram the enemy aircraft. Göring was 50 years old. He had not flown a combat mission since 1918. He was addicted to morphine.
He weighed close to 300 pounds, and he now commanded the daily behavior of men like Philip by decree. On the same day the order arrived, near Cologne, something happened that the German High Command had not planned for and could not explain.
A formation of about 40 Messerschmitt Bf-110s was assembling to attack a stream of American B-17s. The Bf-110 was a two-engine heavy fighter. It had been designed in the 1930s to escort bombers over long distances. When that role failed during the Battle of Britain, the Germans repurposed it as a bomber destroyer.
They hung rocket tubes under its wings. They loaded it with 20mm cannons. They sent it up in large formations to fire salvos of rockets into the tightly packed American formations from outside the range of the B-17's machine guns. The tactic worked. It had killed hundreds of American bomber crews.
It was, by the autumn of 1943, one of the pillars of the German air defense of the Reich. The 56th Fighter Group had been ordered to escort the bombers that morning. They were at 30,000 feet. The Bf-110s were below them, still climbing into firing position. The Germans did not see the Thunderbolts. They were focused on the bombers.
29-year-old Hubert Zemke looked down at the formation and understood the situation with the clarity of a man who had waited months to see it. The Bf-110 was a large twin-engine aircraft. It could not turn quickly. It could not climb steeply while carrying rockets.
And it had committed itself to a flight path that assumed no American fighters would be present at 30,000 feet. Zemke pushed his nose down. The Thunderbolts followed. The 56th Fighter Group dove out of the sun at speeds above 400 miles an hour. Their combined firepower tore through the German formation.
Bf-110s came apart in the air. Some of them lost engines. Some of them lost wings. Some of them simply dropped, trailing smoke and pieces of metal toward the fields of the Rhineland below. About 15 were destroyed in a matter of minutes. Not a single Thunderbolt was lost. The B-17s continued to the target.
They were not molested by fighters that day. The doctrine of the bomber destroyer, the pillar of the German defense of the Reich, had collapsed in the space of a single interception. The Luftwaffe would not rebuild it. There was no time. 4 days later, October 8, 1943, 156 American bombers took off for Bremen and Vigesack.
More than 250 P-47 Thunderbolts from 6 fighter groups escorted them. Among the escorts were the pilots of the 56th, again led by Zemke. Rising to meet them were the fighters of Jagdgeschwader 1. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 was Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, now 7 days into his new rank.
Philipp took off from a Luftwaffe airfield at 1411 that afternoon. His wingman was a young non-commissioned officer named Feldwebel Hans-Günther Reinhardt. Philipp flew a Focke-Wulf 190A6, marked with the red numeral 6 on its fuselage. The aircraft carried the factory number 530407.
It had been built by a Focke-Wulf plant that itself would be bombed within the year. Over Bremen, the formations converged, American bombers in tight boxes, American fighters above them, German fighters climbing from below. The sky filled with contrails and gunfire, and the small tumbling shapes of aircraft coming apart in the freezing air. Philip made contact with the American escorts. He radioed a victory over a Thunderbolt, somewhere over northern Germany, at some altitude that was never precisely established. An American P-47 fell out of the fight after Philip's pass. His 207th confirmed kill, his last.
Then the German transmissions record one more sentence from his aircraft, a command to his wingman to attack. It was the final message he sent. What happened in the next minute is not perfectly documented. Feldwebel Reinhardt saw his commander's Focke-Wulf disappear into a cloud.
Reinhardt himself was then struck by another aircraft in the chaotic combat and made a forced landing. That evening, When the reports were tallied at the WWII headquarters, one aircraft was missing. Its pilot was the Commodore. He had bailed out. His parachute did not open.
The victory was later credited by American records, with the qualification of belief rather than certainty, to 23-year-old Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. Johnson was the same man who had, 3 months earlier, brought home the Thunderbolt with 200 holes in it.
He had learned since then how to fight the aircraft the way it wanted to be fought. He had climbed above the enemy. He had dived. He had fired his 8 machine guns for a single second. He had zoomed back to altitude. He had, without knowing it that afternoon, just killed the second-ranking fighter ace of the German Air Force.
The news would not reach him for weeks. When it did, he did not celebrate. Combat pilots learn early not to think about the men on the other end of the guns. The Wehrmachtbericht, the official daily communique of the German armed forces, announced Philipp's death on October 12.
It described him as one of the outstanding fighter pilots and formation leaders of the war. It did not say who had killed him. It did not say what aircraft had killed him.
The German public was not told that the pilot who had killed Hans Philipp had been flying the 7-ton airplane that German fighter pilots had, only months earlier, been calling a flying barrel. The funeral took place at the Trinitatisfriedhof in Meissen on October 14. Philipp's coffin was draped in the German war flag.
His decorations were displayed on a velvet cushion at the entrance of the town hall. His mother Alma stood beside his fiancée and other members of the family. A senior general delivered the eulogy. Officers of the Luftwaffe formed an honor guard. Meissen was 300 miles east of Bremen. It was a small city.
In its cemetery, Alma Philipp watched her only son lowered into the ground. On the same day as the funeral, October 14, 1943, 650 miles to the west, the 8th Air Force launched its second raid on the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. The Germans had spent 2 months preparing for this raid.
Every fighter they could muster went up. The Americans sent 291 B-17s. They lost 60. 600 American airmen were killed or captured in a single afternoon. The mission became known as Black Thursday. It was, at the time, the worst single-day loss the 8th Air Force had ever suffered.
And this is the point at which the story becomes almost impossible to explain to anyone who was not there. Because in the same month, October 1943, 2 things were true at the same time. The 56th Fighter Group destroyed 39 German aircraft while losing only 1 of their own.
In their crew rooms, in their bar at Halesworth, they were beginning to understand that they had found something. Their P-47s, the airplanes their bomber crews had once mocked, were winning every engagement they entered. And at the same time, at the strategic level, the American daylight bombing campaign was collapsing.
Bomber losses were unsustainable. The chief of the 8th Air Force, General Ira Eaker, was under quiet pressure from Washington. Some senior officers argued the campaign should be suspended until long-range escort fighters arrived. The Luftwaffe was not being beaten. It was killing Americans faster than America could replace them.
Both statements were true. The mathematics of a single fighter group had begun to work. The mathematics of a bombing campaign had begun to fail, and the same month contained both facts. Zemke understood the paradox. He also understood something else. The 56th Fighter Group's success was still a squadron-level phenomenon.
It was still, in October 1943, dependent on his personal supervision, on tactics he had not yet written down, on habits of altitude and discipline that he had not yet taught to any other American fighter group. If the doctrine remained inside his head, it would die with him. He began to write it down.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, the same problem was being studied from the opposite direction. On November 10, 1943, at a Luftwaffe test facility called Rechlin, a 29-year-old test pilot named Hans-Werner Lersch climbed into the cockpit of a captured P-47.
The aircraft had been forced down more or less intact somewhere over occupied Europe. German mechanics had repaired it, applied Luftwaffe markings to its fuselage, and nicknamed it Beetle. Lersch's job was to fly it, to take it apart in the air, to write a report that would explain to the German fighter community what they were actually facing.
Lersch was one of the finest evaluation pilots in the Luftwaffe. He had flown captured Spitfires and Hurricanes. He knew what he was looking for.
He climbed into the Thunderbolt expecting to confirm what everyone in the German pilot community already believed, which was that the aircraft was crude, over-engineered, and inferior to European fighters. He was in the cockpit for 90 minutes. He came out with a report that contradicted the beliefs of his own service.
The cockpit, he noted, was not oversized because of American incompetence. It was oversized because a pilot could sit in it for 8 hours and still fight at the end of that time. The instruments were not simplistic. They were designed to be readable by pilots trained in 9 months rather than 4 years. The airframe was not inefficient.
It was built to absorb damage and return home. Every design choice the Luftwaffe had dismissed as evidence of American backwardness was in fact evidence of American operational thinking. The Americans were not building fighters for a duel. They were building fighters for a war. Lersch's report was filed in the German intelligence archive.
It was read by senior officers. It changed nothing about the aircraft the Luftwaffe was flying, because the Luftwaffe could no longer change what it was flying. It could only lose the pilots who flew what it had. By the time Lersch finished writing, Hans Philipp had been dead for 33 days.
His mother Alma was still returning to the cemetery. His wingman Reinhardt was still recovering. His aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190A6 with factory number 530407, was scattered across a field somewhere in northern Germany.
And in England, in a Nissen hut at Halesworth, 29-year-old Hubert Zemke had finished the first draft of a document he did not yet know how to distribute. It was a set of tactics for flying an airplane most people considered a failure.
It was a series of arithmetic problems that added up to a war he had, until October, not been sure he could win. He needed the rest of the 8th Air Force to read it. He needed the Republic aviation engineers on Long Island to solve one more problem. And he needed the winter of 1943 to pass without another disaster like Schweinfurt.
None of these things were guaranteed, but the doctrine was on paper now, and the men who could turn it into a weapon were about to gather at an airfield in eastern England for the coldest meeting of the American Air War. December 8, 1943, Kingscliff Airfield in Northamptonshire, England. A dining hall converted for the occasion.
The heaters worked poorly. The men who filled the room kept their leather jackets on. Every fighter group commander in the 8th Air Force was there. Some had flown in through low cloud that morning. Some had driven from bases as far away as Debden and Duxford. They came because the order to attend had been signed by General Ira Eaker himself.
At the front of the room stood Hubert Zemke, 29 years old, 6 months of combat command. He had a small stack of papers, a chalkboard, and a set of numbers he had refined through 9 months of watching men die. He did not use rhetoric. He was not a rhetorical man.
He wrote figures on the chalkboard and turned to face the officers, who outranked him in almost every respect except the one that mattered in that room. He told them the P-47 could not turn. He told them to stop teaching pilots to turn.
He told them the airplane could dive faster than anything in Europe, and that this fact, and this fact alone, was the doctrine. Altitude was money. Height became speed. Speed became position. Position became a burst of fire, and then the pilot climbed away before the enemy could respond. He was to make one pass. He was not to fight.
If he fought, he would die. Some of the officers in that room resisted. They had spent their careers teaching young men to dogfight. They had trained pilots to trust the stick, to feel the aircraft, to close with the enemy and win by nerve.
Zemke was telling them that everything they had taught was wrong. For the airplane the 8th Air Force was flying, he was telling them that discipline mattered more than instinct. Some of them believed him. Some of them did not. The ones who did not would eventually watch their casualty lists teach them the same lesson.
Zemke left Kingscliff that night and drove back to Halesworth in the dark. He had done what he could. The rest depended on other men. Some of those men were engineers.
250 miles across the Atlantic, at Republic Aviation on Long Island, teams of designers had been working on the one problem that Zemke's doctrine could not solve on its own. The P-47 could win the fights it entered, but it could not fly far enough to reach most of them.
The internal fuel capacity of the P-47 was 305 gallons. The combat radius that resulted was too short to escort bombers into central Germany. The Republic engineers began building drop tanks, then larger drop tanks, then pressurized drop tanks that would feed fuel at high altitude.
By early 1944, they had produced a design that added external tanks capable of holding another 150 gallons of fuel. A fully loaded P-47 now weighed 9 tons at takeoff. It needed every foot of a British runway to get airborne, but its combat radius had extended from 230 miles to 425.
Berlin was 510 miles from the English coast. The mathematics were tightening. February 20, 1944. The first day of what 8th Air Force planners had labeled Big Week. 941 bombers took off in the pre-dawn dark. Targets spread across the aircraft factories of Germany. The 56th Fighter Group flew with them.
On the first day, the P-47s escorted bombers to Leipzig, 400 miles inside enemy territory. On the second day, they went to Brunswick. On the third day, Regensburg. On the fourth, Augsburg. On the fifth, Gotha. On the sixth, Schweinfurt again. 6 days, 6 missions.
6 penetrations of German airspace, deeper than anything the 8th Air Force had attempted in 1943. The Luftwaffe rose to meet each of them. The Luftwaffe lost each of them. The German fighter force could no longer absorb the losses it was taking. Trained pilots were being killed faster than the Reich could replace them. Aircraft could be built.
Men could not. At the end of Big Week, American planners looked at the numbers and understood that something had cracked. Not the campaign, the other side. Then came March 6. The mission was Berlin. 660 B-17s, 673 escort fighters. It was the deepest bomber mission the 8th Air Force had ever launched.
Every previous attempt to reach the capital had cost bombers by the dozen. Some had never even reached the target. The 56th Fighter Group crossed into Berlin airspace at 11:22 in the morning. They were the first American fighters over the German capital. Zemke was flying. He was 30 years old now.
His group had 18 months of combat behind it. He spotted a formation of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts assembling to attack the bombers. 70 contacts, perhaps more. His Thunderbolts dove from 33,000 feet. They hit the German formation at 460 miles an hour.
Zemke destroyed a Focke-Wulf over the Dummer Lake area. His wingman destroyed a Messerschmitt. The group as a whole destroyed 18 German fighters that day. 2 Thunderbolts were lost. 1 pilot came home, 1 did not. The bombers reached Berlin. They dropped their bombs. Some of them did not come back.
B-17s were damaged and 11 went down, mostly to anti-aircraft fire. But no bomber was lost to fighter attack during the bomb run itself. The escorts held the Luftwaffe away. American fighters had reached Berlin. The airplane, once called a mistake, had escorted a 1,000-bomber raid to the capital of the Reich.
And here the story could end. If this were the kind of story that ended with a fighter pilot, it is not. The real ending is a set of numbers. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts before the war ended. They were the most produced American fighter of the war.
They were built in factories that ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, staffed largely by women who had learned to weld and rivet in the 18 months after Pearl Harbor. They were flown by pilots trained in 9 months on a curriculum written by men who had studied the failures of 1942.
They were maintained by ground crews who could turn an aircraft around between missions in less than an hour. The Luftwaffe, in the same period, could not replace Hans Philipp. He had trained for years before his first combat. He had flown for years more before he was killed. Every hour of his experience was, by 1943, irreplaceable.
When his parachute failed to open over northern Germany, Germany lost not just a pilot, but a body of knowledge that could not be reconstructed. The same was true of every senior Luftwaffe pilot who died in that autumn and that winter and that spring. The Reich was running out of the one commodity it could not manufacture.
The 56th Fighter Group would fly for another 14 months. It would destroy 665.5 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, the highest total of any group in the 8th Air Force. It would produce dozens of Assises. It would lose men. It would train replacements.
It would, by the end of the war, be commanded by a different man, because Hubert Zemke would be shot down over Germany on October 30, 1944, when his P-51's wings separated in severe turbulence, and he would spend the last months of the war in a prisoner of war camp as senior Allied officer for thousands of prisoners.
But the doctrine outlived the commander. It had been written down. It had been distributed. It had been taught to men who had, in turn, taught it to men who would fly F-86s over Korea and F-4s over Vietnam. The energy management tactics that came out of Halesworth in 1943 remained valid as long as fighters had wings.
At the end of the war, an interviewer sat down with a German fighter pilot named Heinz Baer. Baer had flown against Americans, British, and Russians. He had 220 confirmed victories. He had survived when almost none of his contemporaries had. He was 31 years old at the end of the war.
Baer had flown against the P-47 many times. He was asked what he thought of the airplane. His answer was quoted afterward, in one form or another, in almost every serious history of the American fighter effort. The Thunderbolt, he said, could absorb an astounding amount of lead. It had to be handled very carefully.
It was not a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was a professional assessment from a man who had spent his adult life trying to kill people flying that aircraft, and who had watched too many of his own die in the attempt.
In Meissen, in the porcelain city in Saxony, where Hans Philipp had been born to a single mother, the small grave in the Trinitatisfriedhof continued to receive visitors. Alma Philipp came often. She had lost her only child.
She was, by any reasonable measure, one of hundreds of thousands of German mothers who had lost sons in a war their country had started and lost. Her son had killed 207 men. Her son had been killed in turn by an airplane his own fellow pilots had once mocked as too heavy to fight. She lived until 1973.
When she died, she was buried next to her son. The story of the P-47 is not a story about the courage of a single pilot. It is not even a story about the brilliance of a single commander.
It is a story about what happens when a nation with 15,000 factories decides to build an ugly, heavy, disparaged airplane in enormous numbers, and gives it to young men who are willing to fly a doctrine written in cold Nissen huts by an officer nobody promoted to general. The Germans laughed at the airplane in the spring of 1943.
They stopped laughing in the autumn. By the spring of 1944, they no longer had the pilots left to laugh at anything. And by the spring of 1945, most of the men who had once made the joke were dead, or prisoners, or standing in the rubble of cities that the bombers of the 8th Air Force had spent 2 years reducing to brick and ash.
The Thunderbolt was ugly. It was heavy. It was slow to climb. It could not turn with a Focke-Wulf. It won the war it was built for. Not because it was elegant, but because it was there. Not because it was clever, but because there were enough of them. Not because its pilots were braver than the Germans they faced, but because those pilots had been given a set of numbers by a quiet lieutenant colonel from Missoula, Montana, and had trusted those numbers with their lives. Sometimes that is what history is.
A machine no one wanted, flown by men no one remembers, according to a doctrine no one had time to write down until it was almost too late.